Welcome to this sewing tutorial where I'll show you how to transform a button-up shirt into a designer corset style top. This is a great upcycling project that takes a thrifted shirt and turns it into something unique. To follow along, you'll need my corset pattern, which you can purchase from my Etsy shop. Make sure you've printed it out and cut out all the pattern pieces before starting. Now let's see the materials you'll need. First, button up the shirt and lay it flat, or even better, put it on a mannequin so you can see how the pattern pieces will sit. Take your front, middle and front side pieces and position them on the shirt. The top of the front side piece should sit about an inch below the underarm seam, and you should cut it as close as you can to the side seam. Once you're happy with the placement, mark it, and then when the shirt's laid flat, draw around the pattern using tailor's chalk or a disappearing fabric pen. Start with the centre front piece, lining it up with the centre of the buttons. Trace around it and then flip it over and mark the other side. Draw around the front side panels, making sure it's an inch below the underarm and as near to the side seam as you can get. Now cut them out. Remember to be careful not to cut straight through both layers of the shirt, and we are going to save the bottom part of the shirt so that you can use it for a ruffle or a bustle detail. So I would cut in from the button placket, not from the bottom. For the back, fold the shirt in half. Keep everything nice and symmetrical. Place the back pattern pieces on the fabric, trace around them, and then pin them to cut them out neatly. Once all your corset pieces are cut out, iron on the interfacing to give them more structure. I like to iron it on first before cutting it because the interfacing can shrink when heated. Now let's move on to the sewing. Now it's time to put everything together. Match up the notches on your corset pieces and start sewing them together. Open up the seams and give them a good press. Keep everything nice and flat. Now we are going to repeat the process for the lining. We're going to cut out the same pieces from lining fabric, but this time when you cut the centre front piece, instead of cutting it and drawing it twice on the button placket, we're going to cut it double layered on the fabric and add a 1 centimetre seam allowance. This is because the lining needs a seam down the centre for us to add a boning channel. Now let's add boning to give the corset its shape. We'll be adding boning to the centre front, under bust seams and side seams, and we'll be making another channel later on. Cutting the boning 3/4 of an inch shorter at the top and bottom of the fabric length so it doesn't get in the way of our seam allowances. If your boning has sharp edges when you've cut it, use a lighter to melt them down or file them out slightly smoother. For the centre piece, take a strip of sew-in boning, place it right down the centre of the seam allowance, and then we are to sew it to the seam allowance only, not through all the fabric. To do this, fold the fabric out of the way so you're only stitching onto the seam allowance and the boning. Sew straight down one side, keeping the boning centred, and then flip the seam allowance open and stitch down the other side. When you flip your fabric back over, you'll see that the boning is secure inside the seam allowance, but there is no visible stitching on the outside of the fabric. Continue this for under the bust seams and the side seams. The process is the exact same. This time though, we will be doing it on the main fabric. After this, your boning is fully secured and we're ready to move on to attach the lining to the corset. With right sides together, pin the lining to the corset and sew only along the side back edges and the top edge. Leave the bottom and the cup areas open for now. Once sewn, trim down the seam allowance, flip it right sides out, and then press everything nice and flat. To keep things looking nice and neat, do a top stitch just a few millimeters from the edge. At this point, you'll also sew a boning channel along the back seam and insert the final pieces of boning. Sew a channel larger than 1 centimetre and insert your boning into it. Then do a basting stitch along the bottom to stop the boning coming out and keep everything neat. I do this with a really long stitch so I can remove it later. Now the corset base is done, let's move on to the shirt part. Now this is the part where everything comes together. The key thing to remember is that everything pivots from the underarm seam. Everything in front of the underarm seam will be sewn into the corset cups, and everything behind the underarm seam will hang freely over the corset, creating a draped back look. To shape the back, cut a slight curve to where the fabric will transition to the underarm seam. This is where you can really tell this isn't just a pattern, it's an upcycle, because depending on the shirt that you've started with and your personal preference, you may have to maneuver areas to fit. Then fold over the edge twice, about 5 millimeters each time. Press it flat and sew it down to create a nice clean hem. For the front, we need to shape the fabric to fit the bust area. To do this, use 2 long basting stitches around the curved edge and gently pull the threads to gather the fabric. Adjust the gathers until you're happy. I always keep the straight vertical parts without any of the ruching and then use the curve to ease it in like you would do a sleeve. When you're happy with it, sew it down. I would keep trying it on at this point and make sure the fabric is sitting nicely. Now let's clean everything up and add those final details. Attach bias binding along the corset edge, sewing it to the front first. Then trim the excess and fold it over and stitch it down neatly. Now to finish off the bust cup edges, also using bias binding. This gives everything a nice, clean, professional look while enclosing all of the raw edges. Take your bias binding and place it right sides together with the top edge of the bust cup. Stitch it down directly in the centre of the bias binding. This helps keep everything even and ensures that when we fold it over, the finished edge sits neatly. Once it's stitched in place, trim the excess seam allowance underneath to reduce the bulk. Then fold the top edge of the bias binding over to the inside, pressing it flat as you go. Finally, top stitch from the outside, just under the bust cup to secure it in place. If you're not confident at getting this perfectly neat, I highly recommend hand stitching the binding first with a basting stitch. That way you can check that everything's aligned before going over it with the machine. Once you're happy, stitch it in place with your machine and remove the hand stitching for a super neat finish. Finally, add in grommets. I mark evenly spaced holes down the back and install grommets using a presser tool or a hammer set. Thread through at least 4 meters of ribbon so you can fully loosen the corset when putting it on and off. If your shirt has short sleeves, you can add elastic to create a puffed sleeve look, or for long sleeves you can either keep them as they are or cut them shorter for a more cropped effect. And that's it, you've transformed a shirt into a fully structured corset top. If you're happy with how it turned out, I'd love to see your results, so feel free to tag me or share your creations. Also, if you're interested in adding a bustle or peplum hem, let me know in the comments and I'll make a separate tutorial just for that. Thanks for watching and happy sewing.